Ready? Tommy, you slide over.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining us tonight and welcome to our webinar on temporary structures. My name is Rob Hickman. I'm the manager for sport at Gale Gates. For those of you that don't know, Gale Gates are the insurance broker on behalf of the Football Australia program nationally. We represent the member federations, associations, and the clubs at an individual level. We're joined today by our insurers, SLE Worldwide. On my left, I got Peter McKenzie, who's the general manager with over 40 years experience in the insurance industry. And on my right, I have Tom Thorogood, who's a senior casualty claims manager with 45 years experience in the insurance industry. Before we jump into the content, there's a couple of little housekeeping rules I need to run through. Microphones will remain muted for all participants throughout this presentation. You are strongly encouraged to use a Q&A panel that should be available on your screen. Submit your questions through there and we will triage them and answer as many of them as we can today. If we're unable to get to some, then we'll make sure we respond in due course following this. We also note that our advice does not purport to be legal advice, and we're not able to provide any legal advice during this webinar. Now, before we get into the actual context of what temporary structures is and what the endorsement provides and doesn't provide, I thought I'd give a little bit of an overview of the general market and the policy coverage that's in place and how the market and insurance mechanics impact what you see from your insurers and the state of how that may look moving forward. So liability, in essence, is what we're talking about today. The temporary structures falls under your public and products liability policy. Liability essentially covers you for any claims brought against you for third-party injury or property damage. And that's where SLE come in and provide the cover. So in the insurance market, in more of a macro level, it works in a little bit like a clock. A bit of supply and demand, competition comes and goes. So you have what we call a soft market, which is very much a buyer's market. In a soft market is where we would see a lot of insurers in the space looking to write risk. It creates competition for your risk. In turn, when there's lots of competition, obviously we use that to help negotiate premium down and broaden coverage to provide the best cover you can get. Now, once you run through several years of a soft market, naturally insurers may see declining profits. This is impacted largely through things from flood, storm, hail, big catastrophic events. It may be large losses, such as in sport with large injuries, deaths. Also, we see impacts of things like COVID. Financial services come into it as well, so reduced interests and things like that also all impact an insurer's ability to generate profit. As you have a sustained period in that soft market and profits reduce, you see basically competition for your risk may drop. Insurers will remove from the market as they look to underwrite risks in somewhere that has less risk or more defined within their appetite. So we find ourselves at the moment really right in the thick of a hard market, what we call the hard market, which is the exact opposite, where there's not huge amounts of insurers who are participating, particularly in sports space at the moment, because of the nature of the risk is so high. Also, the program this size is large. It's a national program. It covers everybody that plays football in Australia from the NPL down. So insurers that have the capacity or the ability to underwrite such a program are few and far between at this time. And obviously the impacts of losses there when there isn't competition means insurers have to tighten how much risk they're willing to take on. So insurers aren't allowed to just go out and grab every piece of business they can find and underwrite risks and keep going everything. They have to actually demonstrate capital that they hold, and then can only underwrite certain risk exposure in that capital. Ultimately, the reason is you don't want to have an insurer who doesn't have the financial security to pay your claims. So obviously in a time of a hard market, they want to ensure the capital that they have that allows them to write risks is going into areas where they believe they can make profit and obviously meet the needs of their customers. So hopefully that gives a little bit of a context into where we are in the market, where we see the impacting premiums, premium increases, where we see coverage, where often we might be able to negotiate large covers, expanded covers, we'll be able to negotiate with alternate insurers to generate risk. At the moment, there is a strong ethos on you need to work with your insurer. We need to be able to partner. We're lucky with SLE that we have been together with the football program for over 10 years, which has generated a good amount of good faith and premium pool. And we need to continue to build on that. But it also, this market sort of shows the importance of risk management and how we need to really engage proactively in risk management to help prevent losses in the future arising, to protect the program that we've got. Ultimately, a liability policy is probably the most important policy you could have. Without it, you simply cannot function. It is the policy that protects everybody that comes on your site at the weekend, whether it's in the association's clubhouses, if it's on the football pitch, so all the participants, spectators, suppliers, and so on and so forth. So without the liability policy, there is no football. So without further ado, I'll pass over to SLE Worldwide, and they will take us through what the endorsement is, why it's here, and the implications of it, and where coverage applies and where it doesn't apply. So over to you, Jeff.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you all for having us tonight. We're happy to be a part of this webinar. So just to give you a little feedback on SLE, we're quite a unique insurance organisation. We're not a general insurer, so you probably know your household covers and your motor vehicle insurer. We do not do any of those type of products. We're purely here to service the sports, leisure and entertainment industry, and SLE's been doing that for over 25 years now, and I've been with them for just under 25. So you are what we do, so we want to make sure we do it right for you, and there's longevity that we can sustain between yourself as a client, a broker, and us as to keeping your insurance program in place. Now, the way we look at amateur sport is generally by the membership base, because the way we look at exposure is the sport itself, the playing the game of football, on field, off field, and just some general fundraising activities or social functions. So that's how we look at your cover. And that's how we look at the risks. So when there's things that start falling in the program that we don't deem are part of the risk or can have serious impact on your insurance program, that's how we as underwriters look at mitigating that by imposing certain exclusions or endorsements to such, because this is not an exclusion to a full degree. It's all we're stating in this cover is parameters need to be set around how scaffolding is set up and packed down. Because obviously in recent times, there's been a matter now that has occurred, which has caused a death, which will ultimately have an impact on the insurance program going forward, depending on how that claim eventuates. And so that's a segue into Tom to probably give you a bit of background onto the effects of that. And then we could start talking about what is a permanent and what isn't fixed.
Well, thanks. Yeah, certainly that death claim caused underwriters to take a more significant look at scaffolding. I'm sure that there's not a club out there that would want to have to deal with an incident like that, where one of their spectators has been killed by a tower scaffold that blew over on top of him. So underwriters are not only aware of that particular matter, but there are other scaffolding matters involving music festivals where scaffolding has collapsed on patrons, one where one of them blew over, equipment falling from these scaffolding onto spectators. So there have been a number of incidents in the last couple of years, which has caused underwriters to really take a look at scaffolding now. And that brings into play the specified activities exclusion, which this exclusion simply states that the policy will not cover temporary structures erected by clubs. But what you've really got to note is the definition of a temporary structure. The temporary structures we're talking about are structures that are erected by clubs for the viewing or filming of a soccer game. So those are the temporary structures we're talking about. If you have a structure up against the side of your clubhouse for the purposes of doing some maintenance, or a temporary structure for some other purpose, that is not a temporary structure within the terms of this endorsement. So why is that? Well, taking a look at the temporary structures that clubs use, these structures, temporary structures for viewing and for filming, those that are likely to be in place for long periods of time and likely to be very close to where spectators are. So that's why in this endorsement, the temporary structure that we are talking about are those specific structures that are erected by clubs that are for viewing the game and for filming it. Now, a temporary structure, there's been an answer to the question about what is a temporary structure and what is not. Some clubs have structures in public parks and areas where they have a license to operate, and they have perhaps a hire agreement where there are structures on those parks. And if the structure is cemented, concreted into the ground, and has footings and cannot readily be moved, that's not a temporary structure. We've had numbers of claims involving people injuring themselves on those types of structures. So we're not talking about those structures. So these temporary structures that I've just outlined are not covered unless the club hires in a contractor or a person who is capable, who has the ability to provide the sort of tower or mobile scaffolding structure.
Expertise.
Yeah, they have the expertise required to ensure that the structure itself complies with Australian standards, and also the structure is constructed in accordance with the scaffolding guidelines. So if a club has one of these erected by somebody like that, then that is fine, as long as the person or the company that supplied and constructed the scaffolding provided you with details of their liability insurance. And the scaffolding guidelines suggest that you should have a handover certificate supplied by that person, that company, which simply says that the scaffolding complies with the Australian standard, either a tower scaffold or a mobile scaffold, and that it's been constructed and sited in accordance with the standards. So therefore, if the club does that, that structure, that temporary structure, a temporary structure for the purposes of viewing or filming a soccer game is covered. Some of the questions I think that have come through that relate to, well, why are insurers doing this? I mean, we have contractors doing the work for us. We have agreements. We have hold harmless clauses. We have all these sorts of things that should protect us within the terms of the agreement for the hire and construction of the scaffolding. But the trouble is that's not the whole legal answer. If that scaffolding, that temporary scaffolding, is situated, allowed to be and remain on a property that you are the occupier of, not necessarily the owner. All you need to be is the occupier of. And if you are the occupier of that land with scaffolding on it and something happens, I can assure you that our legal fraternity will be after you in regard to compensation for anyone who has been injured. That is certainly the case in regards to the family whose husband was killed by the scaffolding that collapsed. So whilst all the agreements and the indemnity clauses, hold harmless clauses, and liability insurance, whilst those put the club in the best legal position they can be put in, it's not the whole answer. You will still be brought into litigation as the occupier of the premises, of the property, and the endorsement will cover you in regards to whatever the club as an entity is involved in, or your volunteers or members working on behalf of the club. So I guess that's an encapsulation of how I see this endorsement.
Yeah, I might just jump in. That's a really good point that Tom mentions there on, using third parties and why, and sort of touching on that vicarious liability versus full cover, which I can see a question's just come in on it. It's important to note that really this is a way of putting good risk management practices around the risk. So when we're using a third party, or you're using a third party provider and a third party installer, by doing that, you know that the equipment is well maintained, is up to current standards, it's being put up by professionals who are qualified to do this job, which hopefully protects the risk to the extent that it shouldn't fall down. And as Tom mentioned, it puts you in a much better legal position to recover as much of that loss against that third party if something does go wrong. The important bit is that there is still cover, and quite a lot of cover under the policy for your vicarious liability. And it's almost touching on a question I can see. The vicarious liability, as Tom mentioned, you will always be brought into any claim brought against you. The person who's injured or the family acting on the person are always going to sue you as the club, as the association, first and foremost. Then it's from there, SLE and your insurance policy will respond, it will defend, it will pay those costs, those legal costs, which are substantial. But it allows them to then recover as much of that loss as possible, which may be decided in court for proportionate liability, which is where they determine who was at fault. The scaffold is on your premises. You will always have an element of responsibility. You will always have an element of that risk, and will have to pay some form of compensation if something goes wrong. But at least this way, it's a way to ensure that there is a way to recover. And that brings it back to the role of trying to protect the liability policy, trying to protect your claims history. By doing that, obviously the impact in the whole program and the flow-on effect in football is huge. We know, obviously, as life or insurance premiums as a whole, as they go up, that cost needs to be passed down to the players. Ultimately, the players' registration fees we know are going up to cover not just liability increased premiums, but across the board. So we need to make sure we're doing everything we can proactively to protect that liability policy. It shouldn't, or all insurance policies, it shouldn't be viewed as something that's, we paid for it, we expect everything to be claimed on. Absolutely, you can do that, but ultimately it's going to push the premiums higher and higher. It's going to impact the cost of registration for football. If it got too far out of hand, obviously it could impact the number of members that we have who participate in football, and obviously it could be detrimental to the wider program. But it's important that the vicarious liability is still extensive. As long as you follow that process, you are indemnified. The policy will respond, it will protect you. It just means we need to be a bit more rigorous in ensuring we're using third-party providers and people who know what they're doing in that regard.
Yeah, so ultimately the destiny is in your hands on how well your risk management is conducted throughout Australia. So again, I see one of the questions is, are we covered if we use scissor lifts? Now, as an amateur sporting group, I would not expect too many clubs to be owning their own scissor lifts. I see that in the entertainment industry, and we have seen claims out of scissor lifts. Scissor lifts do not fall into the definition of a temporary structure. They're actually almost form a vehicle, don't they, Tom? Again, the use of a scissor lift, if it was being used, I would not have an issue with it as long as the risk management protocols are in place of exclusion zones and getting the scissor lift in place. So I don't think we want to get lost on what a temporary, it literally is a structure that is temporarily designed and built.
Yeah,
I think built's the operative word as well, isn't it? Constructed.
Certainly the suggestion is that if you have a scissor lift on your site, that piece of apparatus should be operated by somebody who has a yellow card, and a yellow card is somebody who has undertaken the safety requirements for the use of that particular type of equipment. That's the only comment I'd make in regard to that.
Your thoughts on the highlighted one, Tommy, up there?
Which one's that? The top one?
A mobile set of stairs that have been manufactured by third
Yeah,
party.
so we're moving on to the Q&A.
Well, we're sort of going around it, so
but we're on the topic, so let's
that's right. So let's keep addressing.
We've got a question for you then, Tom. We use a platform which is not fixed. It's a mobile stair set with a platform at the top. It was manufactured by a third party and has the third party's details and the Australian standards that it complies with placarded on it.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts on an industrial manufactured and commercially available access platform coming within your definition of a temporary structure?
Well, I think it is a temporary structure. But I mean, the point is that, you know, it's a mobile stair, okay? Fair enough, it's been manufactured by a third party. That's excellent. Third party details you have, and it complies with the Australian standards. But if you're saying to me that you have this type of platform and the club are the ones who are constructing it, placing it, putting it in place, I would say that in these circumstances, you need to ensure that you have a professional who's putting the thing in place, making sure it's safe, and providing you with a handover document to say that it's safe. May well be required as time goes on to have the platform inspected to make sure that it continues to be safe.
Excellent. Another question is, I've sort of touched on vicarious liability, but do we want to
I think we've
clearly define the difference between full and vicarious?
Well, full is obviously when you're taking that's fully covered by the policy, or it's not fully covered by the policy. So in this scenario, if you are erecting temporary structures yourself, you have no cover afforded under this policy. So that's where vicarious is. So what vicarious is you're brought in on an action that's been caused by another party, not yourself. So that's the definition in theory of vicarious.
For instance, if something occurred in regards to a temporary structure that had been put in place by an independent contractor, somebody's injured, the independent contractor is sued, he turns around and brings in the club. You were the occupier, you knew it was on your property, you knew it was that spectators were going to be close by. You didn't maintain it, you didn't do what you're supposed to have done. So we're going to include you now. We're going to third party you to this action. That's what we're talking about.
Perfect. I had another question that came through this afternoon on email that I'll pass on to you while those questions are still filing through. We've had one that says, if we are the owner of the scaffolding and it was erected by a third party, so i.e. shouldn't be covered because it's their own, but we have it certified each year and it is safe and a compliant structure, why is this not covered?
Great.
So, I mean, first of all, it's a temporary structure. You're saying it's a temporary structure.
It's a fixed structure. It's installed by a third party. The only bit that doesn't meet the criteria of the policy is the club owns it.
Well, I mean, if it's fixed, I mean, we're talking, this endorsement is talking about temporary structures. If it's fixed, this endorsement wouldn't apply to it.
But there's still a requirement under the policy that it is provided and erected by a third party. This one is owned by the club and erected by a third party.
Yeah. Okay, so we're only dealing with half of the requirement here.
Yeah, and we're getting it reviewed or inspected to ensure that it is compliant within legislation, I guess, with that respective states.
Well, I think that's fair enough. I mean, you know, if it's compliant with the Australian standards, and it's
erected and dismantled by the third party.
And you know, maybe it's recommended that you get a handover certificate.
Yeah.
If those things are complied with, fine.
Yeah, I think that's probably the difference here. If it's provided by a third party, erected by a third party, then all you need to go and obtain from that provider is a public liability certificate of currency, which maybe we hadn't mentioned yet today, and ensure you have that on record. You don't necessarily need to submit it through to us every time. Ensure you have it stored in time of need if it is needed. The difference being if you have your own equipment then and it's erected by a third party, you have got to go through that extra rigor. I don't know if there's cost involved in making sure it's inspected and it's compliant and you have all the relevant documentation to prove so. So looks like we reached an agreement. You can use it, but a little bit more rigor to ensure that it is compliant and meets that definition. One other question I had someone who said, is it okay if our temporary structure is fixed to a permanent structure? So it might not necessarily be bolted in the ground, but maybe it's fixed to a permanent stand.
Is it permanently fixed?
Not duct tape. I think we're talking nuts, bolts.
Well, I mean,
I guess to get the definition purely fixed. Yeah.
I mean, it's permanent, is it not? I mean, it's not mobile. It's not temporary. I mean, it's fixed to something that's permanent.
It becomes a fixed structure.
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, if it's fixed to something that's permanent.
Yep, I agree. My interpretation is it is, but
yeah.
I'm answering the questions that'll be an ask. Okay, excellent. Thank you. So next one we've been advised that we need to be listed as an interested party on the public liability of the scaffolding provider. Why is this required? If they are appropriately insured, why do we need to be named on their policy?
An interested party. An interested party normally simply identifies to the insurer of the scaffolding provider that there is another party that's interested, okay? And I guess this is where the vicarious liability comes in, that, hey, you know, we've got somebody else involved here, they've got somebody else who's interested. And the scaffolding providers, public liability insurers want to know who's got an interest in this.
But to be clear, that's not a requirement of the policy that it has. So if you'd received a certificate of currency from a scaffolding provider and you didn't have your interest noted on that policy, you will not be rejected from a claim point of view. So it's a help in some degree, but as you say, how you've explained it, it just indicates a party who's interested. It doesn't mean say you've got any cover under the policy. It just means you've got an interested party.
The idea being behind it that if the third party, in this instance, a scaffolding provider, if you were named as an interested party on their certificate of currency, if a claim was brought against them, their insurer should advise you that there's an incident that you need to be made aware of. It's probably one of those, I probably shouldn't go into this, but probably one of those things in insurance that it's not really worth the paper it's written on. In reality, nothing happens. It's good practice though. It's probably something that it's supposed to streamline the process in the event of a claim. In reality, it has very little impact. So yeah, I shouldn't worry too much. about that, but yeah, if you can get it done, by all means do. If it's difficult for a scaffolder to get them to do it, which I could imagine it would be, yeah, not to worry about it. It's certainly not a condition of the policy that happens.
I think one point we haven't raised yet is once they are erected, from a risk management point of view, the no-go zone, which becomes a very important aspect of the risk. So in the unfortunate circumstance, should the scaffolding fall, if there's a deemed parameter around where it falls, then that eliminates your exposure to another level of actually causing someone bodily injury.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of risk management practices that you should probably undertake, an exclusion zone around it so that if it falls, obviously it doesn't crush anyone. As Peter mentioned, getting it tested, or not tested, getting it inspected and tagged if that's required. I would also note there are different work safe legislations or work health and safety across the various states. We can't give advice on it, but it's important to be aware of those depending on the size of the structure that you're using. There are different conditions there on how often they need to be inspected.
We had one recently, didn't we, Tom, where the structure was erected and it turned out it wasn't on a level surface. So once the weight got on top of the structure.
Yeah, it was a music festival one. They hired in scaffolding, and what they did was they positioned the scaffolding on a slight hill, slight incline. But what they didn't realise was that once they got their patrons on the top, the centre of gravity went beyond the base of the scaffolding, and it just tipped over, injuring the 3 people.
Yeah, crazy. Other practices would be putting a structure up only when required, taking it down at the end of a football weekend or a match day weekend, so that it's not up throughout the week. Obviously, I don't know who accesses the grounds during weeks, or if they're able to access when you're not there, but even so, you probably have people training almost nightly, so it makes sense to not have the structure there when it's not required.
Kids like to climb.
Exactly. Ensure that the structure is only accessed by those people required, i.e. a cameraman. We don't need any of his family, friends, or yourselves up there just to get a better view. Keep it limited to those required. Make sure access is easy, particularly when you consider as well they need to potentially carry up large camera equipment, so access by staircase rather than a ladder. So it's taking all those appropriate measures, that generally makes it a lower risk. And again, just putting things in place to protect you and protect the policy is how in the future we can drive better outcomes in future renewals for the policy. We've got another question that's come through. If the mobile stairs are fixed by bolts and brackets by a licensed builder to an outbuilding that was built by a licensed builder.
And so permanently
Just this
accepted
would be no longer deemed.
I think so, yeah, that's what we touched on before. So yeah, if it's fixed to a fixed structure, if it's fixed to anything, it becomes fixed.
It's not temporary.
Yeah, it's no longer temporary. I think that just about answers all the questions we have there. So probably the key points are temporary structure is obviously when it's not fixed. If it's bolted into the ground or is secure by reasonable methods, not tape or cable ties, but by concrete, by cement, by footings, that then deems it to be a permanent structure, not a temporary structure. We are only talking about structures that are for the purpose of viewing or filming football. So if you've got your little gazebo that sits over the sausage sizzle and people stand under it, little marquees, that doesn't fall under part of this.
We've had times like that. Yeah,
I'm sure many, a little gust of wind, but they're not for the purpose of viewing or filming football. I had one that mentioned a dugout, a question I had a couple of weeks ago or last week. Would our dugouts are on wheels? Would they fall part of the temporary structure? No, essentially they're part of the tables, chairs, benches, and those sorts of things that you wheel out on a match day. They are not included. This is purely for filming and viewing football on a platform. I think they're probably the key takeaways. Any other key takeaways from you, gents?
I think just the focus on safety with these things, that's what we need, the focus on safety. That decreases the risk, that makes underwriters happy.
Yeah, I think ultimately this is obviously came from, as Peter mentioned at the beginning, the primary intention of the liability policy is to cover your footballing activities in terms of playing football, spectating football, training for football, whilst on your grounds. This event, or the event that we saw unfortunately in Queensland, it's severe. Obviously, it's sad and it's unfortunate, and it has had a major impact on the policy premium as well. This is now about putting parameters in place and putting risk management in place to try and help prevent that from happening again, essentially. So without any more questions coming through, which doesn't appear so, I think we'll wrap it up there. Thanks everyone for joining us. Really appreciate it. Thank you, Tom, and thank you, Peter. If you do have any further questions, feel free to pop them through on an email to myself, or if you don't have our details, it can go to your local member fed or association and they'll cascade up. We're more than happy to get back to you on those. This has also been recorded, so we will be sending out a link for you and you can distribute it to all the clubs and federations and associations for them to view at a later date. We hope you found it useful. And yeah, thank you very much.